True power does not shout, it does not demand attention, it simply waits until the room realizes it cannot breathe without permission. The winter solstice gala hosted by the Hawthorne dynasty was a monument to old money, a glittering fortress of crystal and velvet where the city's elite gathered to congratulate themselves on their own existence. Into this temple of inherited arrogance stepped a woman who did not belong, a woman whose very presence disrupted the carefully curated illusion of superiority. She wore a midnight blue gown that absorbed the light of 1,000 cascading crystals overhead, moving with a quiet, lethal grace that made the air around her feel heavy. No one knew her name, but within the hour, she would be the only name left on their lips. The Hawthorne estate was a masterpiece of exclusion. For 6 generations, the family had ruled the financial sector, their legacy built on ruthless acquisitions and a profound disdain for anyone who had to earn their wealth. Tonight was their crowning achievement, a celebration of an impending corporate merger that would solidify their monopoly for another century. Laughter echoed off the vaulted ceilings, sharp and shallow, mingling with the delicate clinking of imported champagne glasses. But as the woman in midnight blue glided past the statuesque ice sculptures and the string quartet, the laughter began to curdle. Whispers flared like struck matches. Eyes darted toward her, assessing, judging, and ultimately dismissing her as an interloper. She did not flinch beneath the weight of their collective gaze. Instead, she let them look, an apex predator wandering through a herd that had forgotten what teeth looked like. The disruption inevitably drew the attention of the apex predators of the Hawthorne clan. Julian Hawthorne, the golden-haired heir presumptive with a smile that resembled a drawn blade, detached himself from a circle of sycophants to intercept the anomaly. He approached her with the casual saunter of a man who owned the floor beneath his feet, his tailored tuxedo doing nothing to hide the predatory slump of his shoulders. He blocked her path just as she reached the edge of the grand ballroom, his eyes raking over her with an insulting lack of urgency. He did not ask for her name. To him, she was a symptom of a lax security team, a minor inconvenience that could be brushed away with a condescending smirk and a snap of his fingers. He spoke just loud enough for the nearest guest to hear, turning the moment into a spectator sport. He informed her that the catering entrance was around the back, a tired insult meant to draw blood quickly and efficiently. The sycophants trailing him dutifully produced a chorus of muffled snickers. The woman did not blink. She merely looked at Julian as if he were a particularly uninteresting piece of modern art, her silence stretching until the snickers died in the throats of his audience. She told him, her voice a low melodic hum that carried effortlessly over the string quartet, that she was exactly where she intended to be. Julian's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine irritation. He took a step closer, invading her personal space, attempting to use his physical presence to intimidate her into submission. It was a tactic that had worked 1,000 times before against lesser rivals, but against her, it was like trying to cast a shadow on the ocean. Before the tension could snap, the crowd parted for the architect of the evening. Victoria Hawthorne descended the grand staircase with the slow, deliberate pacing of an empress presiding over an execution. She was a woman carved from ice and platinum, her eyes a pale, terrifying blue that missed nothing. Victoria had sensed the disturbance from the balcony and had come to restore order to her flawless sanctuary. She drifted toward the standoff, her arrival heralded by a sudden, oppressive silence that swallowed the ballroom. The music faded into a hesitant hum as the musicians sensed the shift in the room's atmosphere. Victoria stopped a few feet from the stranger, her gaze dropping to the floor and slowly rising, an agonizing appraisal designed to make the subject feel as small as a grain of sand. When Victoria finally spoke, her voice was a velvet-wrapped hammer. She asked her son why the staff was mingling with the guests, her tone dripping with a honeyed cruelty that had broken countless careers. Julian laughed, a sharp, ugly sound, and explained that the woman was confused about her coordinates. Victoria stepped closer, invading the fragile space between them. A flute of dark blackberry liqueur balanced perfectly in her manicured hand. She leaned in, her perfume a suffocating cloud of rare orchids and cold cash, and whispered that she admired the woman's ambition but despised her ignorance. The stranger did not retreat. She held Victoria's gaze, a terrifying calm radiating from her dark eyes. It was this defiance, This absolute refusal to look away or show fear, that triggered the matriarch's venom. Victoria could tolerate many things, but she could not tolerate an unbowed head in her own domain. With a smile that could have frozen a raging river, Victoria tilted her hand. The dark, syrupy liqueur spilled over the rim of the crystal flute, dropping in a heavy, sluggish stream directly onto the woman's gown. It hit the delicate fabric at the shoulder, spreading like a bruised, spreading stain across the midnight blue silk, ruining a garment that likely cost more than a luxury vehicle. The collective gasp from the surrounding crowd was instantaneous and intoxicating to the Hawthorne matriarch. Cameras from the hired press discreetly angled toward the spectacle, capturing the degradation in high definition. Victoria handed the empty glass to a stunned waiter who had materialized at her elbow, sighing with a theatrical, exaggerated regret, remarking that some stains simply could not be removed, no matter how hard one tried to scrub away their origins. The woman stood perfectly still, the dark liquid dripping from her fingertips, and for the first time that evening she smiled. The silence that followed was not one of shock, but of predatory satisfaction. The socialites of the Hawthorne inner circle leaned in, their faces illuminated by the glow of 100 smartphones capturing the fall of the woman in the stained blue silk. Victoria Hawthorne smoothed her own immaculate gown, her eyes gleaming with the triumph of a queen who had just crushed a rebellion before it could even begin. She expected tears, a frantic exit, or perhaps a desperate attempt to dab at the ruin of her clothes. Instead, the woman simply looked down at the dark violet streak across her arm, her expression as unreadable as a deep sea trench. She didn't reach for a napkin. She didn't cover the stain. She simply looked back at Victoria, and for a fleeting second, the matriarch felt a cold shiver of genuine, unadulterated dread. The stranger reached into a small, structural clutch and retrieved a sleek, obsidian-colored device that looked more like a piece of military hardware than a phone. The air in the ballroom seemed to thin, the oxygen sucked out by a sudden, inexplicable shift in the room's electronic hum. With a single rhythmic tap on the screen, the woman initiated a sequence that bypassed every firewall the Hawthorne estate had spent millions to maintain. Simultaneously, every digital surface in the grand ballroom, the massive projection screens intended for the merger announcement, the tablets held by the catering staff, even the personal devices of the guests, flickered into a blinding, uniform white. The music did not just stop. It died with a digital screech that silenced the room more effectively than any shout. Victoria's smile didn't just fade, it disintegrated. Julian stepped forward, his face flushed with a mixture of confusion and burgeoning rage, demanding to know what she thought she was doing. He reached out to grab her arm, but the woman shifted an inch, a movement so precise it made him stumble into the space she had occupied a second before. Then, the screens changed. A logo appeared that turned the blood of every billionaire in the room to ice, the stylized phoenix of Ethelgard Holdings, the global conglomerate that had been the silent partner behind the Hawthorne's proposed merger. Below the logo, a live video feed blinked into existence, showing a high-tech boardroom halfway across the world, filled with executives standing at attention. The center of the frame, however, remained empty, a seat waiting for its occupant. The woman in the ruined blue gown didn't look at the screens. She looked directly at Victoria, whose skin had turned the color of ash. In a voice that was no longer a hum but a gavel strike, the woman informed the room that she was Ava Sterling, the founder and majority shareholder of Ethelgard. The name hit the crowd like a physical blow. The mysterious titan who had avoided every camera for a decade, the woman who controlled the very lifeblood of the Hawthorne family's future, was standing before them, dripping with their cheap wine. The transformation in the room was instantaneous and nauseating. The guests who had been snickering seconds ago now looked like they wanted to melt into the floorboards. Julian's mouth hung open, his arrogance replaced by a hollow, terrified vacuity. Victoria attempted to speak, her voice cracking like dry parchment as she tried to bridge the impossible gap she had created. She stammered about a misunderstanding, about the heat of the evening, about how she would personally replace the gown with anything Ava desired. Ava let her flounder, watching the Empress of Entitlement crumble into a desperate, grasping shadow of herself. Ava noted that the wine was actually a very fine vintage, but it lacked the complexity she required in her business partners. She tapped her device once more, and a document began to scroll across every screen in the hall. It was the merger agreement, the document the Hawthornes needed to stay solvent, At the bottom, in real time, the signature line for Ethelgard Holdings turned bright red and dissolved into the word void. The gasp that went up was the sound of a dynasty dying. Without that merger, the Hawthorne Empire was a house of cards in a hurricane. Investors in the room began frantically typing on their phones, dumping their stock before the news hit the public markets, but they were too late. Ava had already synchronized the cancellation with the global exchanges. On the screens, a ticker showed the Hawthorne Group's valuation plummeting, losing billions of dollars in a matter of heartbeats. Victoria grabbed the edge of a marble pedestal to keep from collapsing, her eyes wide and wet with the realization that she had just traded her family's legacy for one moment of petty cruelty. Ava stepped closer, her stained sleeve brushing against Victoria's pristine white lace, marking her. She told Victoria that she had come here to see if the rumors of the Hawthorne character were true. She had hoped to find partners with the dignity to match their bank accounts, but instead, she had found children playing with fire. The exit was as quiet as the entry. Ava didn't wait for an apology, because an apology from the defeated is merely a form of begging. She turned her back on the wreckage of the gala, walking through the center of the ballroom as the elite parted like the Red Sea. No one dared to whisper. No one dared to look her in the eye. The cameras that had captured her humiliation were now broadcasting the Hawthorne's ruin to the entire world. As she reached the heavy oak doors, she paused and looked back at the stunned, silent crowd one last time. She remarked that power is a privilege, not a right, and that those who use it as a weapon eventually find the blade turned against their own throats. She stepped out into the cool night air where her security detail was waiting, their black SUVs idling like idling predators. Inside the hall, the first of the creditors were already calling Victoria's phone, the sound of the ringtone echoing in the hollow silence of the ballroom. The winter solstice was over, and a very long, very cold season had begun for the Hawthornes. Ava sat in the back of her car, watching the lights of the estate fade in the rearview mirror. Her assistant handed her a fresh silk wrap, eyeing the wine stain on her shoulder with concern. Ava took it, but she didn't wipe the stain away. She looked at her reflection in the dark window, the city lights dancing across her features. She told her assistant that the evening had been a success. She had gone in to sign a contract, but she had left with something much more valuable, the knowledge that some empires are better off burned to the ground. The car sped away into the heart of the city, leaving the past behind, while the internet exploded with the story of the woman who used a glass of wine to drown a dynasty.